Okay. Got it.
Can everyone see the source sheet?
Not yet.
Yes,
Ah.
we have it. Uh-huh.
Can you make it a
Okay.
little bit bigger?
Yep. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, we're in Parshat Toldot, Yakov and Esav. I want to primarily look this evening at Rav Hirsch's analysis of the story. But we'll do a little bit of preliminary work to sort of set the stage and get everyone back into it. So the parsha begins as we're familiar, describing the struggles with infertility of Yitzchak and Rivka. And finally, after I think I mentioned it over Shabbos, right? That we're told that Yitzchak prays for Rivka, and was it the Radak, the Rashba? I think the Radak, no, the Chizkuni, I think it was, says that Rivka could only be, become pregnant after Yitzchak prayed for her, because there was a concern that if Yitzchak wouldn't have prayed, then everyone would say, oh, she became pregnant, she was blessed with children because of the blessing given to her by her brother and her mother Lavan.
Oh,
And that would have
right.
been inappropriate, because Lavan, as we know, was a Rasha, was an evil person. So it was only after Yitzchak davened, right? Question is, well, if Yitzchak davened for her earlier, would they not have been confronted with struggles of infertility? That's an interesting question based on that comment. But in any case, we're picking up in the story during her pregnancy. Okay, so now Rivka is pregnant. The Torah tells us, "Vayitrotzitzu habanim b'kirba, v'tomer im kein lama ze anochi, v'telech lidrosh et Hashem." The children struggled in her womb, and she said, "If this is the case, why am I?" Right? They translate here, "Why do I exist?" Rashi reads it as, "Why did I desire so badly to have children?" And she went to inquire of God. Vayomer Hashem la shnei goyim bevitnechu shnei leumim mimei ayach yiparedu. God tells her, you're carrying twins, and they're going to become two different nations. And the one people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Her days, it came time for her to give birth, and behold, there were twins in her womb. The first one emerged covered in hair, and he was red, and they called him Esav. And then his brother came out, and his hand was holding on to the heel of Esav, and he called him Yakov. And Yitzchak was 60 at the time that they were born. The boys grew up. Esav became a hunter, a man of the field, and Yaakov was a simple man who dwelled in the tents. Yitzchak et Esav kitzai befiv v'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov. Yitzchak loved Esav because he provided food for him, and Rivka loved Jacob. Simple story, right? So what questions do you have as we refresh ourselves with this episode, with this telling of the story of Yaakov and Esav? What anything that you notice, perhaps new or from a different perspective than you've seen before? Hey, Marty.
How we doing?
Doing great. How are you?
Good.
We got
All right.
a special guest for this year.
All right.
Oh, wow.
So what any questions that emerge from this passage? Anything that catches your interest?
Well, one thing I noticed is that the usual translation I've seen about Jacob, it says that he was a simple man dwelling in tents, but this
Right.
translated as raising livestock, which is a whole different meaning.
Yeah, yeah, there are a number of commentators who say that, right? What does it mean that he dwelled in tents? He can't be that he sat around doing nothing all day.
Well, there's a school of thought that he sat around learning all day.
Right. So that's a whole other question I think we looked at in previous years about what would he have been learning and where would he have been learning it. But yeah, there is a wide school that says that he was in fact involved in raising cattle. And right then that's how we explain his success in shepherding for Lavan when he has to run away next week.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Parallel to that, just after it, this is a different translation than I've ever seen. The description of Esav, his father appreciated him because he provided him, it says, because he had a taste for game.
Yeah.
He Said Bakfiv, which is usually more negatively translated as somebody who likes to trap people with his mouth. In other
Right.
words, his father perhaps it's implying, I think he appreciated the deftness with which he could take words and turn them around or something. I don't know, put a positive spin on it, at least in that way. But to have a taste for game, ta'am is taste, but anyway, I thought that was
Yeah.
a different translation.
Yeah, we'll see the Rashi who says that other explanation towards the end of this year tonight. But I mean, the translation's interesting, but right, the sentiment I think is well known, right? That he liked the food that Esav provided for him.
Yep.
Yeah, Beatrice, please.
I'm curious what the connection is between Rivka being told by God at the very outset that the older will serve the younger,
Yeah.
and then how she comes to favor Yakov, because is the latter the result of the former?
Right. So there are many who say that, right? That either she
Interesting.
was taking an active role in ensuring that this prophecy would come true, or that the idea was planted in her head that the younger one is destined for great things. So maybe that's who she should. I mean, it's hard to say that a parent should love one kid more than any other kid, but that the seed was planted for her to show favor to Yakov because of what God told her. It certainly does raise a question of chicken and egg, which came first, and what was there a cause and effect going on here? Okay, so those are some good observations, and then of course there's the most obvious question. I asked for a new question, so I'll forgive you for not asking. But right, what gives, right? Well, how is it, right? We're so well trained that Esav is the bad guy, and Yaakov is the good guy. So how is it at all possible that Yitzchak, who we assume was a righteous man, who knew right from wrong, so how does he favor Esav? What's going on here? So I want to first just give a couple, really just one sort of provocative train of thought that might address it, but then we'll come back and see what Rav Hirsch has to say on it. So in order to see this train of thought, we're going to skip down to source number 4 quickly. And this is just later on in the Parsha as Yitzchak is preparing to bless Esav. Vayiki zaken Yitzchak vatichahena inav mirot vayikrat Esav beno hagadol vayomer lav beni vayomer lav hineni. When Yitzchak was old and his eyes were dimmed, he couldn't see. He called Esav his older son, and he says to him, "My son." And Esav responds, "Here I am." Vayomer hinei nazakanti lo yadati yomoti. Yitzchak says, "I am old. I don't know when I'm going to die." Ata sana chilecha telyecha v'kashtecha. So therefore, take your weapons, your instruments, go out in the field and hunt me some food. Aseli matamim kasher hafti vehivet havia li v'ochela ba'avor tevarchecha nafshi b'terem amut. And prepare for me food that I like and bring it to me and I'll eat it in order that I will bless you before I die. The Or HaChaim, and then it gets even more explicit in the Radak, has a very interesting take on this. He explains in source number 5, why does Yitzchak want to bless Esav, his older son? Nitimnat ta'am lama lo kara leYakov, ki zeh habachor, ulai shelo yada mehamechar. So the question is, why did he call Esav and not Yakov? Yakov had bought the birthright, right? The birthright at this point was deservingly Yaakov's. So it's possible, he says, that Yitzchak didn't know about this, that no one told him that Esav had sold it. V'tam Yitzchak sheyachafetz levarich Esav harasha, ki chashav shebe'emtzaut habrachot hapech lemidah hatov. The reason why Yitzchak wanted to bless Esav, even though, according to the Or HaChaim, Yitzchak recognized that Esav was a bad guy, is because he thought through the blessing, he would influence Esav to be better. It pains, really it pains any parent, but certainly it pains a righteous parent when their children are evil. And he was trying to make Esav into a better person. And it's possible that that Esav was open to change, right? As we see later on, when Yakov and Esav ultimately reunite, that when Yakov introduces Esav to all of his children, Dinah, his daughter, is not mentioned. So Rashi quotes a medrash that says, why was Dinah not presented to Esav to meet her uncle? It says that Yakov was afraid that Esav might have become attracted to Dinah and wanted to marry her, and Yakov wanted to save Dinah from marrying such a wicked person, and for this, Yakov was punished. So the Medrash assumes that Esav might have been swayed by Dinah, that Dinah might have won him over and convinced him to do good, but Yakov didn't see that. But at this point, Yitzchak, yeah, go ahead.
That would have meant Dinah married her uncle.
That's a whole other question. How that could be okay.
It's a prohibited relationship later on, isn't it?
Correct. It's prohibited. I don't know how they get around that, but anyway, I mean, Yaakov himself was married to 2 sisters, which was also prohibited. But anyway, so he says that Yitzchak thought he could persuade Esav through the bracha. And the Radak says basically the same thing. Let's just go to number 7 in the Radak, the second source of the Radak. Next page. Aseli matami, make for me tasty food. Lo haya shoel hatzaid lechisaron shaya lo mima'achal. He didn't ask Esav to go hunting because Yitzchak was lacking for food. Ashir gadol haya mikneh harav hayalo. He was a wealthy man. He had lots of cattle. Ela shazekinim nafsham katsa behem mitavim ha'machalim uvakshim davar chadash. But because Yitzchak at this point was old people are more picky with what they eat. They like to have new things and not the same thing over and over again. So therefore, he wanted this freshly caught food. This was something unique, something special. Therefore, Yitzchak asked Esav to bring him game so that he would be in favor with him and Yitzchak would bless him. Because Yitzchak knew that Esav needed the blessing, because Esav on his own wasn't a good person. Yaakov didn't need any blessing. Because Yitzchak knew that Yaakov would get the blessing to be the spiritual heir of Avraham. Okay, so again, they say that the blessing that Yitzchak wanted to give Esav was perhaps an attempt to improve, to work on Esav to improve his ways, which is quite an interesting read on the situation, right? Not that Yitzchak was blind to what was going on with the 2 children, but that he was but he was trying to actively insert his influence over Esav. Quite interesting. Okay, so now let's get into what Rav Hirsch has to say on the episode. We'll start with sort of a side point, but I think it's quite telling. Back in source number 3. So remember what happens is Rivka is experiencing difficulty during her pregnancy, and she goes to inquire of God what is going on here. And God tells her, you're carrying twins, right? We know, we didn't look at the Rashi. Rashi tells us what's Vayitrotzitzu, that they struggled. Says it's from the shoresh, from the root of la roots, to run. That whenever she passed by a house of idolatry, Esav would want to emerge from the womb because he was attracted to Avodah Zarah. And whenever she passed by a synagogue or a Beit Midrash or whatever institution of learning and monotheism there was in her day, Yakov would want to come out. And so she was confused. Why is the child I'm carrying seem to be delivering a mixed message? So therefore, when God tells her, well, it's actually 2 children you're carrying, it made a lot of sense to her. So if that's the case, read very carefully. When it's time for her to give birth, when it came time for her to give birth, behold, there were twins in her womb. Rav Hirsch notes, vihine indicates surprise, something unexpected. How's this a surprise? God told her you're carrying twins. So what's unexpected when twins emerge? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a very interesting point. Well, you can go on with it. I couldn't figure out what he was getting at. I guess one of them was redheaded and the other one wasn't, maybe, or something like that. But that would have been unexpected only if she thought they were identical twins.
Right. So that's the way he goes with it, right? As Rebecca had already been fully informed, she had 2 boys in her womb. Now that this fact is established, it could not have been unexpected. So vihine cannot refer to the fact that it's twins. The opposite seems to be the case. After she had been told of the contrasting differences between the expected children, one would have thought that they would be non-identical twins and look not at all alike. The surprising thing was they really were identical twins. The only difference was in their constitution. One was more developed, stronger than the other. So it was surprising, according to this understanding, that they were similar, right? We focus on the physical differences, that Esav was more developed, was more hairy, was more colored, but that fundamentally they looked very similar. A more radical suggestion is that perhaps the Torah is telling us of the surprise it was to Yitzchak. Maybe Rivka kept this information to herself. So when Yitzchak favors Esav later on, right, to Beatrice's question, it could be because he didn't know that he's supposed to favor Yakov. Could be that Rivka kept the information from Yitzchak. So for Yitzchak, it was a surprise that they were twins because she never told him what God told her. And Yitzchak perhaps continues to favor Esav because he assumes that the firstborn, the oldest, is the one who's going to get the blessing of the firstborn, and he's trying to make him a worthy heir of that legacy. And we'll come back to that suggestion, I think, a little bit later. But the next piece of Hirsch's analysis is based on the Medrash in source number 8. Vayigdalu hane'arim, the boys grew up. Rabbi Levi Omer, mashal lahadas v'itzvonit shayu gedilim ze al gabe ze. Rabbi Levi made an analogy to a myrtle and a rose bush, which are growing right next to each other. Kevan shehigdilu V'hifrichu zenotein reicho v'zeh chocho. And once these plants mature, the hadas, the myrtle, gives off the beautiful smell that's familiar to us from Sukkot. And the rose bush, even though it's beautiful, gives off its thorns. Kach kol yud gimel shana shnehem olchim leBeit HaSefer u'shneim ba'im meBeit HaSefer. So the same is true with Yakov and Esav. For 13 years, until they became grown, right, until they became bar mitzvah, they both went to school, they both came home from school. Lachar yud gimel shana zeh haya holech lebatei midrashot v'zeh haya holech lebatei avodat kochavim. But once they become bar mitzvah, Yaakov went to the base medrash and Esav went to the house of idolatry. Rabbi Eliezer, and this is just a very interesting aside. Rabbi Eliezer says a person must care for his children until they're 13.
Can you move that up a little? Like,
oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Mikan ve'elach tzarich sheyomar baruch sheptarani me'onsho shel hazeh. From then on, after 13, he should say, "Blessed is God who has separated or forgive or pardon me from the punishment this one deserves." That's the bracha that parents make for their child at the bar mitzvah. But that in some level, the responsibility of the parent toward the child ends at 13. So keep this medrash in mind as we read now source 9, what Rav Hirsch has to say. And he begins by getting into a very classical debate, which is, are we able to criticize our forefathers? Are we able to point out flaws, or do we have to assume that everything they did was intentional and was for the good? So Rav Hirsch comes down very strongly. Our sages never objected to pay attention to the small and great mistakes and weaknesses in the history of our great forefathers, thereby make them just the more instructive for us. Here too, on Vayigdalu, that the children grew, they make a remark which is indeed a signpost for all of us. They point out that the striking contrast in the grandchildren of Abraham may have been due not so much to a difference in their temperaments as to mistakes in the way that they were brought up. As long as they were little, no attention was paid to the slumbering differences in their natures. Both had exactly the same teaching and educational treatment. And the great law of education, Chanoch lana'ar al pi darko, bring up each child in accordance with its own way, was forgotten. That each child must be treated differently with an eye to the slumbering tendencies of his natures, and out of them be educated to develop his special characteristics for the one pure human and Jewish life. The great Jewish task in life is basically a simple one and the same for all, but in its realization is as complicated and varied as human natures and tendencies are varied, and manifold varieties of life that result from them. When Father Jacob, okay, so what's he saying up until now? What accounts for Esau's becoming a rasha, a wicked person?
The lack of parenting in some way.
Okay, it was a failure in parenting. They did not educate him properly. They didn't tap in to his strengths and his unique personality. When Father Jacob visualized the tribes of our nations and the sons standing around his deathbed, this is at the end of Sefer Bereshit, the tribes, sorry, I think I skipped a line. He saw not only future priests and teachers, he saw around him the tribes of Levites, the tribes of royalty, of merchants, of farmers, of soldiers. Before his mental eye, he saw the nation in all its most manifold characteristics and diverse paths of life. He blessed all of them, ish kavir kato, beirach otam, each according to his specialty, with and in his different path in life did he bless them. For the covenant which God established with Abraham wants to win a whole national life, a whole fresh, complete life, a nation with its manifold classes and occupations, all for the one and same great task of life, Mishmor derech Hashem v'lasot mishpatav, to walk in God's ways and observe his laws. There, strength and courage, no less than brain and lofty thought and fine feelings, are to have their representatives before God. And all, in the most varied ways of their callings, are to achieve the one great common task of life. But just because of that, must each one be brought up al pi darko, according to the presumed path of life to which his tendencies lead, each one differently to the one great goal. To try to bring up a Jacob and an Esav in the same college, make them have the same traits and hobbies, want to teach and educate them in the same way for some studious, sedate, meditative life, is the surest way to court disaster. A Jacob will—
Up a little. Up a little, please. Yeah.
with ever increasing zeal and zest, imbibe knowledge from the well of wisdom and truth, while an Esav can hardly wait for the time when he can throw the old books, but at the same time, a whole purpose of life behind his back, a life of which he has only learned to know from one angle, in a manner for which he can find no disposition in his whole nature. This is a radical comment.
This is interesting because I've seen ads and things for yeshivas
Mhm.
for different kids, who don't
Yeah.
learn the same way and, want to act out and, so they're trying to provide this.
Yeah, this is certainly very much in line with modern theories of education, very much not in line with classical theories of education. But yeah, very much so that we, thankfully, I think that our community does recognize the need for different educational approaches. And this is really the point of tonight's class is, I think we can go much further. There have been, I'm just thinking in more modern times, the past few years, various efforts to create, yeshiva training schools, vocational schools that have gained some traction, haven't gained traction, usually do better when we're not in a recession or the threat of a recession, when there's more philanthropic money. But that there is an awareness that the classical model of yeshiva day school, the yeshiva system, doesn't work for a lot of kids. And that's what Rav Hirsch is saying was the problem with Yitzchak and Rivka, that they didn't recognize that this was not the right model, the right education for Esav.
I think
He takes it a step further. Had Isaac and Rebekah studied Esav's nature and character early enough and asked themselves, how can all the strength and energy, agility, and courage that lies slumbering in this child be won over to be used in the service of God? And the future Gever, the future man, be trained to become not a Gever Tzayid, not a hunter man, but in truth, a Gever Lifnei Hashem, a man before God. Then Jacob and Esav, with their totally different natures, could still have remained twin brothers in spirit and life. Quite early in life, Esav's sword and Jacob's spirit could have worked hand in hand. And who can say what a different aspect the whole history of the ages might have presented? But as it was, Vayigdelu hane'arim, only when the boys had grown into men, one was surprised to see that out of one and the self-same womb, having had exactly the same care, training, and schooling, two such contrasting persons emerged.
Well,
I
is
think that
Rav Hirsch speculating that this is probably a theory of why one son went one way and the other went the other, or is there evidence that Yitzchak and Rivka did not treat them individually? Well, what evidence do we have that?
So we have the medrash that we just saw, right? The medrash that says that, right, they went to the same exact school, they followed the same routine for the first 13 years of life, and then when they became older, is when they parted ways, or their differences emerged more profoundly.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean that's the best proof for this. But it's quite radical. Right, and so it also, right, we have a whole theory in Sefer Breshit that there's this pattern of the Chor, the older son, being rejected in favor of the younger son, and that one child is, quote, in and one child is out. The first is saying it didn't have to be that way, and maybe that's what drove Yitzchak to want to bless Esav, to keep them both in the fold.
What about the Yitzrotzitzu in the womb, that they're already struggling? Should that be read, do you think, as a struggle that can be overcome, or a struggle that's so fundamental that
so I mean, he's certainly reading it as a struggle that can be overcome. He's saying, right, had they recognized that Esav had more brute strength and was more inclined to be an outdoorsman and more inclined to use his hands or whatever, they could have brought him to serve God using those skills and those traits, but they didn't recognize that. So he's certainly seeing it as there was an inclination that he had. He wasn't the bookish, sit in the base measure, sit in the library all day studying, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't be a loyal servant of God, right? If you read it as he really was attracted to idolatry, it's harder to make that. But yeah, I mean, even so, right? The rabbis certainly recognize that there is an attraction and an appeal to idolatry, right? Most radically, right? There are those who say that the korbanot, the sacrifices that we offer, or that we did offer, were a way of sort of channeling these desires, right? That the fact that we're given license to eat meat, to shecht animals, is perhaps an accommodation that's made to these inclinations that people have. So Rav Hirsch adds another factor to this, which is one that I think might be more obvious to us if we think about it. He says the second factor is that we have the parents clearly not on the same page, right? We have them showing favor to different son, and showing more love to one child over the other. As right, we can all recognize that this is certainly a path for disaster when it comes to the relationship in the future of these children and what they're going to be. But there doesn't seem, right, as at face level, it doesn't seem that Yitzchak and Rivka were at all hiding or trying to protect their kids from these feelings that they had. That it seemed to have been a well-known thing that one favored one and one favored the other, right? And that might bring us back to the point made earlier that maybe Rivka didn't share with Yitzchak the prophecy that she was given, right? That could have been to protect him, but it also means that they were not on the same page when it came to how these children should be raised. And that certainly, according to all the theories and everyone who writes about anything with education and parenting, right, that certainly is a recipe for disaster. I want to take this one step further. Okay, and I will I came to this analysis through Toby, actually. Some of you are aware she started working on a doctorate in Jewish education. Dad, this is the paper that I was looking at while we were in Hawaii.
okay.
So through the lens of Jewish education, I wanted to suggest even another step in this dynamic, in this approach of Rav Hirsch. And that is, okay, so Rav Hirsch notes that Yakov and Esav are different, and they were not right, but the parents tried to raise them the same. Now, tonight, before this year, I had parent-teacher conferences at Beth Tefillah for the high school. Okay, no, thankfully, parent-teacher conferences are not a source of stress for us, at least this year, thank God. Kids are doing great, but there are parents for whom it is a source of stress. Why? Because teachers can recognize when a student, when a kid is, needs some work and needs some improvement and isn't necessarily on the path or showing the traits that we would want. So if that's the case, even if Yitzchak's original inclination was towards Esav, why does he not recognize that Esav's not living up to what Yitzchak thinks he is? Why does Yitzchak let it go on for so long? Right, the very trait that he's attracted to is, according to this, and again, there's other approaches to it, but staying within Rav Hirsch, right, the very trait that Yitzchak is attracted to in Esav is the thing that is the key to show us that Esav is not deserving and is not living up to what he should be. So how does Yitzchak remain blind to it? And for this, I want to go back to the Rashi that Anne mentioned at the beginning of this year. Right, that it says that that Yitzchak liked Esav or loved Esav, kitzayid befiv. So Rashi here is number 13, where it says number 2, Yodea Tzayid, knew how to hunt. Latsud l'ramot et aviv befiv v'shoalo abba heach me'asrina tamelach v'tateven. Right, he knew how to ensnare or how to entice or how to fool Yitzchak with his mouth. He was a hunter, as Anne said, not necessarily of animals and of game, but he was a hunter with his mouth, and he was able to fool and trick his father into thinking that he was really concerned with the intricacies of halacha. Right, he asked him these like really specific halachic questions that that we know shouldn't even be taken seriously. But if you're asked the question and you want to be convinced, it could be a sign that a child is really engaged, right? He said, I know that there's a law of maaser, of taking tithes. Well, how do we do it if we're from salt? The answer is there is no maaser on salt. There's only maaser on produce or animals. Right, so but his father thought, oh, he's so meticulous about the mitzvot that he even cares about taking maaser on salt. And so the way that I wanted to apply this to what Rav Hirsch said is that it's not only that that the parents thought that Yakov and Esav should be given this exact same education and where they would each emerge from it the same way. But it was that Esav knew the game. He knew the system, right? It's very easy to go through an educational system knowing what's expected of you, knowing what the quote successful graduate is. And so perhaps what Rashi is getting at here is that Esav knew how to play the game. He knew what a successful heir of Abraham and Yitzchak looked like. And so he was able to fake it. He was able to convince his parents that he really was enjoying yeshiva and he really did know what was going on and he really did care. But it wasn't for any impactful legacy on it. It didn't make any real lasting impact, right? They were teaching him, he was being educated, he was passing each grade just by living in the moment, just by going through the motions and doing what he knew was expected. But that's not what education is, right? Certainly in a Jewish context, but it's not only in a Jewish context. Education is about making a lasting impact, right? Again, Toby's now in a doctoral program for Jewish education, so I'm getting exposed to all these different theories, right? But there's all sorts of theories about moral education, moral development, and how you make a lasting impact on a student is much more than ensuring that they can pass the test. It's much more than ensuring that they can get a passing grade and move on to the next level, the next course, right? And so perhaps the fault was that not only they thought that everyone could and should be educated in the same way, but their metrics for assessing whether they were being successful weren't the proper metrics. They weren't really gauging whether any of this education, whether any of this learning was really getting into Esav's soul and making a lasting impact on him. They were just concerned with getting, passing this test, getting an A on this paper, whatever, getting a B average and moving along. And it wasn't about a lasting impact. And so if that's the case, right, it's not only that Yitzchak was blind and at fault for not giving a proper education, a proper training to Esav, but it really is, it's a problem that unfortunately continues to plague our community. Judy, you're right. There are a lot of, you can call it non-traditional, non-conventional Jewish schools that are out there. And certainly there's a recognition of a need for diverse approaches in education, and that not one size fits all. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of trying to fit everyone into the same box. And there's still a lot of defining successes in very narrow ways. In some ways, the modern Orthodox community does a much better job at this, because we certainly highlight lots of, a broader curricula, broader skills, broader things that we expose our kids to. But in some ways, the modern Orthodox community is just as guilty, if not more, in that we really are a community that so heavily emphasizes the intellectualism, right? The it could be that it's kind of expectation that children to be successful have to become doctors, lawyers, whatever, and any working with one's hands would never be what we would expect of a graduate from our day schools. So that we, it's not only something that we can say this is what the yeshivish world is about and struggling with, and that this isn't something we have to worry about. This is very much an issue that there have been significant developments and very positive steps, but I think there's still a long way to go. As far as what is defined as, quote, successful Jewish education, and what it is that we expect of our kids, of our graduates, of those who go through the system, right? Our biggest challenge often feels to just keep them involved, keep them in the fold, keep them going. But it's not only about being able to check off the boxes, but how are we able to make a lasting impression so that all these things, values, lessons, texts, stories that we want them to know will stay with them and impact them in the way that we hope it will.
When you talked about Esav figuring out his father and sort of talking, misleading him.
Yeah.
I was thinking about students in yeshivas that are really not totally involved, but they may be smart, they may get along, and they think that they are doing the right thing and making their father happy, and really they're not. They may be a very long shot from that. I know that happens often. By the way, I think that the mother should, and ordinarily does, teach them love in all respects, love for Hashem, love for singing, for studying, for being together, and so on. So I think that Rivka did not do that as much with both of her children.
Right. So to be fair to Rivka, I mean, again, this is a very piercing insight. And I think there is, whether it's true in the particular case of Yitzchak and Rivka, there certainly is a universal truth in there, right? It resonates for us. To be fair to Rivka, later on in the Parsha, I forget the exact pasuk. I'm not going to be able to find it right now, but the Torah tells us, Rivka aim Yakov ve'Esav. Rivka was the mother of Yakov and Esav. And there, the commentators all say that, of course, she loved Esav, and she had a great concern for him as well. So I am throwing them under the bus here, but I don't want to totally throw them under the bus. I do want to recognize that when we look at the entirety of the Parsha in all the Mefarshim, it's a much more complicated picture, but I still think there is a truth in this one approach, in this one explanation of Rav Hirsch, and hopefully it's one that if it does ring true for us in our lives, that maybe having an awareness of it can help us overcome this tendency.
I tend to see it through also the eyes of lack of self-knowledge
Mhm.
on the part of both Avraham and Sarah and Yitzchak and Rivka.
Yeah.
The oral tradition that underlies this kind of writing, and Martin Buber actually made a big point about this. How did people remember all these things? Don't we forget that we say that, well, Moshe wrote these things down, okay, but how were they transmitted to him? And there are word plays, and in this one we have this very interesting example of Tamim in the first place being spelled, as you point out, Chaser, that is without the aleph in it, meaning twins. And then later on, Yakov is called Tom.
Right.
And Yakov actually demonstrates more self-knowledge and a greater struggle with the bigger issues with God than any of them did. And he is complimented highly, I noticed, by the Rebbe for this. And so you can have a parent like Avraham who has a son like Ishmael, who seems to be very much like him in many ways. Or you can have a father like Yitzchak, who realizes physically and other kinds of ways his son is very much unlike him. And in either case, there is an unhealthy kind of fascination between the two of them that they can't seem to become aware of. And the same thing happens with the mothers and the sons. So Rivka has a son like Esav, who is very much like her, chas v'sholom, her brother and her father, and so on. So she knows she has to know how to handle him, but it's very hard for her to really establish the same kind of relationship that she has with him as she has with her other son, and so on. There are major psychological problems all over the place with these things, and parents rarely see them, and they certainly are not in a place when a teacher is talking about, what's going on with their kids, to be able to have the insight to know what they're actually doing.
Right.
And none of us do. And which is your last point. Hopefully, if we learn a little bit of this, it will lead us to greater desire to really know who we are, how we come to be, how things that have happened to us block our love and concern for one another. I mean, it's a great issue to raise, but I think looking at the parents and what they did is it as best as we can figure it out. But it isn't just that they treated them the same that way. It isn't that they loved them. At least they loved them somewhat enough to keep a lot of them coming along,
Yeah.
But and as Rebbe also points out, there have been more converts that have come from Christianity than have come from Islam. So even that way, you can't entirely compare these things so easily. But nonetheless, we all need greater insight to how we are, why we act the way we do. And this is a very good example where Yakov himself comes out on top in another way than one might have anticipated.
Right. Beautiful. All right. So hopefully, as we say every week, this gives us what to think about. I hope that everyone has a great Thanksgiving. Those who are traveling, safe travels. And looking forward to seeing everyone in shul on Shabbos. Masks are optional, as long as the COVID numbers stay under control. So it'll be nice to see some faces in shul and not full faces in shul.
Thursday morning.
And I hope everyone has a
Thursday
wonderful
morning.
Thanksgiving. And
Thursday
I'll
Thursday
see you.
morning.
Say that again?
Thursday morning.
Yes,
Chodesh.
Thursday morning, Shacharit, Rosh Chodesh, with Hallel, and Torah reading, 8:15. Hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Bye.